Welcome to a quick discussion of The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword HD. The original is one of my favorite 3D Zelda games, so I wanted to quickly go over the remaster and also talk about how well the original game is held up. Before we get started, I do want to mention that even though I won't be talking about the story or showing endgame areas, there may still be some spoilers in this video because of the structure of Skyward Sword. Basically, the world will gradually change throughout the story, so some background details might be different than they would be at the start. Because of that, I will quickly state that this is, in my opinion, the definitive way to play Skyward Sword, so if you haven't played it before, I think it's definitely worth trying out. Or if you already like the game, I think it's fun to revisit the game in this way. If you didn't like Skyward Sword, I don't think this version will change your mind, because a lot of the problems in the Wii version are so heavily integrated into the story and gameplay that they basically cannot be fixed without basically retooling the entire game. So Skyward Sword was originally released for the Wii, and heavily featured motion controls, which were very polarizing. Other criticisms include the slow pace, but the story and characters were highly praised, so it was very divisive at the time. Some people really liked it and saw past some of the flaws or didn't have an issue with them. Other people really struggled with the controls and the overall flow of the story. So, the Switch version tries to fix some of these issues, but again, some things are so heavily integrated into the core experience that they basically cannot be fixed that easily. The biggest change is the controls. In the Wii version, you could use the nunchuck and Wii Remote to control various different actions. So for example, by shaking the nunchuck, you could basically reflect an enemy projectile or attack with the shield, and the Wii Remote could be used to move the sword. Basically, you could kind of angle the sword, which can be used to cause enemies to guard in a certain direction, so you can swing in the opposite direction to deal damage. Or alternatively, you can basically swing to do a quick slash in whatever direction. A lot of people really had trouble with the overall accuracy of the controls, but I never really had any issues with it. Everything worked pretty well for the most part, outside of a few things not entirely registering properly, but overall I actually really liked the sword combat in the original, and it's honestly still pretty good, even with a new control setup. So in addition to using Joy-Cons, which kind of simulate the motion controls, you can also use a Pro Controller, or in a Switch handheld configuration, you can simply use the buttons. So the right analog stick controls the sword, and clicking in the left control stick acts like shaking in the nunchuck, which is a little bit less intuitive, but overall works pretty well. In general, I do feel like the analog controls actually make the game a little bit easier, and it's actually pretty good. I had very few times where the controls didn't register properly, mostly because the Switch controller doesn't have the little octagonal grooves around the analog stick, so sometimes it would read a left or right motion as a diagonal, as an example. I kind of feel like a GameCube-style controller would actually be really good for this game, so you would be locked to 8-way movement. But overall, it's not too bad. The Joy-Con controls are actually pretty good too, but in some ways feel a little bit less accurate than on Wii, partly because of the lack of a sensor bar. So the original Wii version used the sensor bar to kind of calibrate the pointer to the center of the screen. While in this version, since it's entirely gyro-based, you basically have to recalibrate a lot. In all fairness, you have to actually recalibrate the Wii version quite a bit, and that's something that I got used to in the Wii version, so it was pretty easy to adapt to that for the Switch version. In my playthrough, which lasted about 30 hours, I kind of started out switching between the two regularly, but I eventually stuck with the button controls because they were overall easier, and my left Joy-Con started to drift. So, in general, Both ways work generally well, but I do feel like the button controls are more consistent. Like with the motion controls, I was definitely running into that issue where left or right swings were being read as diagonals, or up and down swings, for that matter, being perceived as diagonals because I wasn't swinging like straight down. I was kind of going at an angle, so it was registering as a diagonal. But beyond a few minor hiccups, it's not that bad. I feel like both ways are very playable, and it is cool to have the options. The option to basically choose which configuration you prefer. But basically, everything in Skyward Sword is motion controlled, so let's head to the sky. Another integral aspect of Skyward Sword is flying on the Loft wing. So this was originally controlled by basically tilting the Wii Remote. You could also swing the Wii Remote up and down to basically gain height, and this is one of those things that generally worked pretty well, but it definitely lacked precision at times. So it's actually nice to be able to play this with a traditional, like, analog control setup. You control this with the left analog stick, like how I'm talking about this being more precise and immediately fly into that. Yeah, overall this is pretty cool, and a lot more precise. One thing I don't like about the Loft wing, and something that I feel like could have been added for this version, basically you have 3 dashes with the Loft wing, which is a lot less than you had with Epona, as an example. So I kind of wish there was a way to upgrade the Loft wing in some way to basically have them dash more frequently, or even start out with like 5 dashes instead, but that might break some of the difficulty, so maybe it makes sense why they left it alone. This also controls somewhat similarly to swimming, which is also a fairly infamous part of Skyward Sword. Some of the swimming sequences are very precise, and trying to navigate those with motion isn't great. So some of the sequences where you have to swim very precisely were a lot easier to get through, and actually felt downright trivial at times. Like there's a particular part of the game that's notoriously difficult, especially on the first playthrough on the Wii version, and I got through it in like 15 minutes on this version just because I generally knew where to go, and also the controls are a lot more cooperative. If you're playing with the Joy-Cons separated from the Switch, you can actually switch between the 2 settings in the pause menu, which is honestly really cool because there are some actions that are easier with the analog controls and others that are easier with motion. So if you prefer to play Switch games with Joy-Cons, you can basically swap between the 2 through the pause menu and basically pick the control setup for each situation. So for example, the main musical instrument of this game is a harp, and honestly I don't like how the harp plays on the plays with the motion controls, so whenever I get to a section with this, I would usually switch over to the button layout and just use the right analog stick to get through that, and then switch back to motion when I was using Joy-Cons. Even with the Pro Controller and in handheld mode, you still also have gyro aiming for weapons like the bow, the hook shot, and others. And you can also move the camera with motion controls, because in the Joy-Con configuration, you can simply use the right analog stick to move the camera, but because in the Pro Controller or handheld setup, you basically use the right stick to move the sword, you can also use, you can just tilt the controller to move the camera instead, and you can also still move the camera manually by holding down L and using the right analog stick. It's a little bit less convenient than using the right analog stick with the Joy-Cons. And honestly, I realized by the end of my playthrough I was instinctively holding down L a lot, even when I was using Joy-Cons, because I was using both control setups like interchangeably. So yeah, I just got used to like holding down L, but it's definitely less than ideal. I definitely think an option, and a lot of people are suggesting this, it would have been nice to have the ability to basically toggle which is the default for the right analog stick and which is the hold action. Or even have it as a toggle where you just press L and it swaps between the two modes. That's definitely something that would have been nice, but honestly I don't think it's game-breaking. I think the game is totally playable, partly because I played the Wii version, where there weren't really camera controls. You basically could only L-target or Z-target to recenter the camera, and that's all the camera control you had. So I kind of just played the game like that a lot at the beginning, where I didn't actually use the camera controls, but just recentered the camera constantly. So yeah, there are ways around some of the quirks, but even though this honestly is a better control setup than the original, there are definitely some weird quirks with this. Another problem with Skyward Sword for a lot of people is the sky itself. It's kind of empty. Like, there are several small islands you can land on, and there are little mini-games or quests on them, but in general, the sky is pretty empty, even in comparison to, like, the Great Sea in Wind Waker. In a way, I actually kind of think of this more like, Termina Field from Majora's Mask than the Great Sea, where this really is just from getting to point A to point B, and not so much for spending a lot of time in between. So like getting from Skyloft to one of the main areas doesn't actually take long, but there's also not that much here in this overworld. Much more emphasis is placed on the actual areas than the overworld itself, which, again, this game actually has some more things in common with Majora's Mask. And to demonstrate this, let's head to the surface. When you enter the surface from one of the Pillars of Light, you have this little map where you can basically choose a warp. There are various bird statues all over each major realm, and you can basically warp to most of them. There are also bird statues in dungeons that let you exit the dungeon really quickly. But in general, there are so many warps that even with the amiibo, which lets you instantly warp to the sky and then back to where you use the amiibo, it's actually not that helpful because there are so many warps as is. The amiibo really doesn't save that much time. It's kind of like Farron's Wind, which is kind of a nice little feature, but I honestly don't use it that much just because of the inherent structure of Ocarina of Time. The same kind of applies to this, where, you know, I might as well just use one of the bird statues instead of the amiibo, because it doesn't save that much time. So let's head to this one. So this is Farron Woods, which is the first major area outside of Skyloft. So in addition to having bird statues, like Majora's Mask with the owl statues, it's kind of also like Majora's Mask because the overall structure of Skyward Sword places a lot of emphasis less so on the dungeons than on reaching the dungeons. Replaying Majora's Mask to get footage for the next review at the end of the month kind of made it more obvious how many similarities these two games have in terms of structure. Like, tonally, these are very different. And in terms of overall design and structure, there are quite a few differences, but some things are kind of comparable. In Majora's Mask, you spend a lot more time simply trying to navigate to a dungeon, basically collecting all of the necessary equipment, whereas in Ocarina of Time, you basically can go straight to a dungeon really quickly in most cases. There are some cases where you have to complete some small side quests or not optional, but like side dungeons, but Skyward Sword and Majora's Mask have much more emphasis on smaller dungeons and different tasks to even reach the next dungeon, which I kind of like. In general, it's almost kind of like the world itself is like a mini dungeon in some cases, which is kind of a cool approach. but it definitely can feel a bit lacking in some ways because of how much downtime there is. But overall, I don't mind it that much. A lot of the things people consider filler in Skyward Sword, I actually don't mind that much. A lot of things are actually kind of neat tests of skill, in my opinion, and don't feel inherently like filler, but some things definitely do drag down the pacing a bit. So yeah, in general, Skyward Sword definitely is not a perfect game, and even with the remaster, there were so many things with the overall flow of the story where it's still basically the same. It's not like with Twilight Princess where they removed some of the collectibles in a couple sequences, or like with Wind Waker where they kind of reworked the Triforce hunt to be a little bit shorter. With Skyward Sword, basically everything in terms of the basic flow of the story is left the same. The only differences are like small tweaks to the gameplay and like some quality of life updates. So you have a companion character named Fi who tends to over-explain things and will constantly pop up and give you tutorial information or point out the obvious. In this version, she actually appears less often on her own, and will basically, the sword will flash to indicate that she has something to say. She will still pop out of the sword periodically to give advice, and some of it is very redundant, but one of the best features in Skyward Sword HD is the ability to quickly skip through text. So basically by pressing B, you can very easily, like, skim through, so when Fi or other characters are giving you information that is redundant or unnecessary, you can speed through it very quickly, so you can easily get back to the gameplay. So yeah, even though a lot of the tutorials are left intact, it is a small change that helps to make the overall structure, or the overall flow of the experience a little bit faster. The original playthrough I did of Skyward Sword on Wii at launch took me about 40 hours, which is fairly standard. And I finished this playthrough for the HD version in slightly under 30 hours. It's like 29 and a half hours. So that's about 10 hours, and some of it can be attributed to kind of knowing what I was doing anyway, even though, in all fairness, I hadn't played the game in 10 years, so I didn't remember everything, but I definitely remembered some things that helped to speed things up. But some of it can also be attributed to simply being able to skip through a lot of the dialogue that wasn't as necessary. So yeah, in general, there are plenty of small optimizations and improvements, even though there are still plenty of inherent problems. So yeah, this is why I would say this is easily the definitive version, the version I would recommend over the Wii version. Also, did I mention the performance? Even though the graphics are fairly similar to the Wii version, I actually really like the frame rate. It's actually 60 for the most part instead of 30, and especially since I'm now working on the Majora's Mask video, which is 20 frames per second, it's actually really interesting seeing a Zelda game, a 3D Zelda game, running at 60 FPS. It will dip occasionally, like in intense boss fights, but for the most part it's really stable, and I think it's worth the trade-off of the visuals not being as improved as something like Wind Waker, where the lighting was completely overhauled. I think the smoother performance is worth the trade-off of a less impressive visual upgrade. Yeah, in general, I really liked replaying this game for the first time in 10 years. It definitely held up well in my opinion. The parts that people disliked, and I heard people disliked over the past decade, I got through fairly easily, and they didn't really drag down the overall experience that much in my opinion. But again, I already liked this game originally, and this is just a better version of it, so with the amount of optimizations throughout, it might not be enough because there is still a lot of like redundant exploration and things like that that might impact the experience for some people more than others, but again, personally, it never really bothered me that much. So with that being said, thank you for watching, and I hope you'll join me next time for another discussion.